You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest of the day, and Dr. Richard Fisher writes with and is an expert at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, and he has a thoughtful piece just a few weeks ago on the future bombers under study in China and Russia. And this is a long, ongoing discussion we've had with Dr. Fisher over the years. And Dr. Fisher, first of all, welcome back to the Final Say Radio Show with Brett and John. We always appreciate your insight and analysis. And it's very important for the American people and certainly our listening audience to understand what our, frenemies, if we want to call them that, are up to in their development of their militaries.
Well, yes. The bomber article came out about 2 weeks ago, and just today, Aviation Week has posted a second article on the big Shanghai Cooperation Organization exercise that mainly featured new Chinese Army mechanized equipment capabilities. But onto the bombers, yes. It appears that the United States, Russia, and China will be introducing a next-generation stealthy flying wing-shaped bomber by the early to mid-2020s. The Chinese program was confirmed to me by Asian sources earlier this year, and they expect it to emerge by 2025. This puts the United States in a quandary because this will be then yet another Chinese weapon system that will be extending their ability to deny access to American military forces to the West Pacific out to the second island chain. China is already working on much longer range missiles to do that as well, in addition to their submarines and fairly soon aircraft carrier battle groups. On to the second article, Peace Mission 14 was a multinational combined arms exercise held by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in late August this year. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization currently has, I believe, 7 members, but 2 of them nuclear armed, China and Russia, but 3 more nuclear armed powers may join in the not too distant future, India, Pakistan, and Iran. And because this organization has generally an anti-democratic, anti-Western character, it's important to watch. There are tensions within the organization, especially between China and Russia, but the fact that they're working together, exercising together, learning how to cooperate intimately should be of concern to us.
It's very interesting, and I'm glad that you mentioned the possibility of India, Pakistan, and Iran joining the cooperation. We were just discussing, when you look at what's going on in the Middle East, there's an awful lot of cooperation between many of the same players, not necessarily India, but certainly Iran, China, Russia, and I guess you could argue Turkey, and to some degree. And I think this is, when you look at from a strategic standpoint for the United States, it's an awful lot for us to swallow, and we have to look at the partnerships that we have. Now, what you're saying with the rising prowess, if you will, of the Chinese Navy and their Air Force and the other weapon systems that they're putting in place, this creates a lot of problems for us. So I guess the question I'd have for you would be 2 parts. One is, what are we doing with our allies in that region to match what the Chinese are doing? And are we looking at alternative bases or strategies to offset and maybe change what our moves on the chessboard are, if you will?
Well, let's start with space. I was privileged to attend the International Astronautical Congress in Toronto last week. About 3,000 space geeks, plus a lot of Chinese and some Russians. The Chinese presentations that I could attend were fascinating. We're going to be competing with the Chinese in space in practically every arena. They're going to the moon. We're not going to the moon. Their space architecture is going to be entirely dual use. It'll have a military character. Ours, sometimes yes, sometimes no. and what are we doing to compete with the Chinese in these areas? Not a lot. Our space program is perennially underfunded, and the vision is not only lacking, but several years ago it was taken away by President Obama himself when he canceled our moon program. But our allies, Japan and South Korea, and our friend India all have moon programs as well. They're not cooperating with each other, nor are they really cooperating with us, and that's not good. That should change. Now, in below low Earth orbit, yes, our alliance with Japan is slowly getting better. It's not getting better fast enough, but positive steps are being made. South Korea is very focused on North Korea, less so on China, and in an annoying way focused on Japan because of historical resentments. Our friend Taiwan is doing a lot to support and defend itself, but it needs to do a lot more. And Taiwan, if it's going to survive, is also going to have to be supported by Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea. And it's really up to the United States to try and sew this together. So if, let's say, all of our allies had very long-range radar and we all shared that data, that in itself would go a long way to deter China. But I'm not sure that this administration is capable of thinking in those terms, and they're definitely not making moves that would add up to that point someday.
Well, I think it's clear they're not capable of thinking, or if they are capable of thinking, it's even worse that they're not capable of caring. So two quick questions related to your commentary. One is, when you look at Taiwan, and not just their need to step up their game, so to speak, but also from a strategic implications and risk profile from their perspective, not necessarily from ours, is not what's happening in Hong Kong right now tremendously important? Because doesn't that tell the people of Taiwan exactly what to expect from any kind of staged reintegration with China? And isn't that, from a secondary degree, doesn't that also even send some level of message over to the Koreas?
Well, the ebb and flow of pluralist forces and the flow back of authoritarian forces and signals has been going on all year across the Taiwan Strait. Remember, earlier this year, the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan made a very loud anti-Chinese statement and literally stopped the function of government for about a week back in April. And it was entirely a statement of fear against the government's ongoing improvement of relations with China. Now, the protests were very peaceful. They ended in an organized way. Yes, there were scuffles, but the students earned great credit and respect for their very dignified composure. All of that has influenced what we now call the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and this really frightens the government in Beijing. This is the kind of contagion that can possibly eventually take down the Communist Party dictatorship if it gets out of control. So indeed, the Chinese, however, understand that if they do another Tiananmen, they may create a vast new number of umbrella movements in many places throughout China. So they want to suppress this, but they want to do it in an indirect and effective but quiet way.
Now, follow up to that, it just occurred to me, don't we still maintain a naval base in Hong Kong, or have we abandoned that? My understanding was I thought we still had one there. No.
We have occasional access to Hong Kong as a recreational port of call, refueling and such. But the Chinese government turns this on or off depending upon the state of relations, especially arms sales to Taiwan. When we sell a major weapon system to Taiwan, turning off access to Hong Kong is one of the first things they do, in addition to promising not to ever talk to us again.
Well, because quite frankly, they're a lot smarter than we are when it comes to tactical or strategic negotiations either way. Let's talk briefly about India. It seems to me that in addition to the risk of them joining cooperatives with either China and or Russia, it seems to me that India is literally, not to undermine in any way the value of our relationship with South Korea and with Japan, but it seems like a continuous, ongoing, growing, and ever more strategic relationship with India might possibly be our only viable hedge against both a long-term China problem, if you will, as well as the even worse consideration of long-term, more strategic and effective alignment between the Russians and the Chinese. So I'd like you to comment on what you think the trend lines look like, and do you think we could trust that India is currently more inclined to lean toward us and our allies versus toward China, Russia, Iran, or others?
Well, when we think about India and the future of our strategic relations with India, it is very necessary to take a long-term view. And remember that first and foremost, India is the largest democracy on the planet and the most complex. There are movements and influences that come from corners we can't see and barely understand that influence the way the government turns. And policy out of Delhi evolves only very, very slowly. It is a very hidebound, tradition-oriented bureaucracy. But it has, over the last 15 years, decided that it must cooperate to a far greater degree with the United States. The old Cold War divide is gone. It took a little over a decade for the bureaucracies in Delhi to fully understand that, but a trend is underway. Now, we should also expect that the Indians will occasionally make decisions that we might not fully agree with, and these will be bumps in the road. But we have to return to the original facts on the ground. India is a democracy. It is naturally fearful of autocratic dictatorships, and it will tend to side with other democracies. It has a very close relationship with Israel, for example, and a relationship that has weathered all kinds of challenge and storms, but it remains strong. Our strategic relationship with India can remain fairly consistent if we can provide enough space to accommodate what will be inevitable glitches.
It's surprising to me that India would even consider, any kind of cooperation with China, being the fact that, there's such a conflict with Pakistan and India, and it's still up in Kashmir. Every day there's shootings going on from one side to the other, but also the incursion of Chinese troops into India that we see occurring all the time, amongst other issues. But to me, it's really in India's best interest to look towards the United States or look towards some of our other allies in China to be a hedge against.
The Indians are longtime practitioners of basic democratic or basic diplomatic principles, such as keeping your enemies close. Mm-hmm. The Chinese have been working very hard to surround India with hostile powers and alliances, and the Indians probably believe to some degree that by joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they can begin to try to reverse this isolation and challenge China's primacy within that organization. I don't think that's a safe bet at all. Joining the SCO is a recipe for tension and conflict. I can see India leaving that organization not too soon after it joins. I could be wrong, but we'll have to just sit back and see how this evolves. If it evolves in a way that threatens American interests, such as the security of military technology we sell to India, well, then we have to take appropriate actions in response. But if, as is most likely be the case, the marriage, so to speak, is going to be quite rough and fraught with arguments, then I think we step back and see how it plays out.
I want to go back to something you said earlier when you were discussing the Chinese going to the moon and some of the space issues. And it seems to me like the United States has made significant gains in space, but in the private industry, and that seems to be doing well. However, you brought up the fact that the Chinese are military; they have a military characteristic to their program, which I don't see how our private space could. And then the other thing that to comment on is that the cooperation that we've had with the Russians with the space station, well, for now at least, has ended. Maybe that could be revised at some point. But it is a step in the wrong direction. So the question I'd have is, should we be looking to South Korea and some of the other countries, even India and maybe Israel or others, to create a new space system and shared programs, if you will?
Absolutely. There are even some arguments for limited cooperation with the Chinese themselves, provided there is absolute equality when it comes to transparency and that we have fantastically rigid safeguards to protect what we hold dear. But in the meantime, this is the time to be looking at the moon, especially because our allies are concerned about the moon and concerned about what China will do there, and they want to have the ability to reach the moon so that they're not denied access to our junior planet. But that's a very expensive proposition. It would also be expensive for the United States. So it makes eminent sense for us to, in the first analysis, devise a cooperative work-sharing plan with our allies and put a corresponding presence on the moon that at a minimum can keep the Chinese honest.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I want to, if we could also just get back to your article that we discussed on the bombers, and it's just I guess it's more an open question, but you provided different makes and models of the different bombers that China and Russia have had for decades, really, and you've also provided some of the quantities of some of their more sophisticated bombers, some in the teens, some in the 60s, supersonic Tu-95s, for instance. If you were to compare the U.S. bomber fleet to the Russian fleet and then add the Chinese into the mixture, do we match what they combined or collectively have? Or maybe not in numbers, but at least the technology and the effectiveness of our weapons, do they match them? Or what is the balance difference?
Well, in terms of a flat comparison with the Chinese have about 120 H-6 bombers, and then a fleet of close to 200 strike fighters of the JH-7 family, and probably another 150 to 200 strike fighters of the Sukhoi 30 family, and a Chinese equivalent. The Chinese bomber force only has a small number of very modern but still subsonic bombers. They're not stealthy, but they are capable of launching long-range cruise missiles and threatening American naval forces or our bases in the Western Pacific with standoff strike. That's a concern, and it's a growing concern, especially if they develop a stealthy flying wing bomber as expected. The Russian bomber force is a bit smaller and definitely a bit older. In the last decade, the Russians have upgraded much of their bomber force with minimal upgrades, especially in avionics. But they don't have as modern a bomber force as the United States. It's also a bit smaller than the numbers of aircraft the Americans have. But the Russians are also committed to a next generation bomber. We don't know how many they'll make. Furthermore, we don't know if they're already or have been cooperating with the Chinese for some time. The fact that both of their bomber programs appear to be marching in parallel strongly suggests, at least to this analyst, that there has been some degree of cooperation. But there's been no open source revelation in that direction so far.
I think that's a good observation, and I would tend to think there has to be some level of cooperation. Now, I guess my response would be, I think that if we look at it as an economic war, as opposed to just trying to come up with, continually come up with new weapon systems ourselves, which we should be doing, but it doesn't mean that we have to go out and spend recklessly. I think that we should be looking at some of the trade we do with China and look at becoming an energy exporter, actually, to take away from some of the economic potential the Russians have to help combat their ability to advance their military programs. I think you heard them economically; they can't advance as quickly and as greatly.
That is an idea that I would support, but I would also point out that capitalism, being what it is, there is a great interest by Chinese petroleum companies, as you might imagine, in the technologies that the Americans are developing to advance the fracking revolution. And if we're not careful, a great deal of that technology could be benefiting China. China also has huge reserves of shale oils that it can exploit inside China itself. And we may be inadvertently assisting a future Chinese shale oil revolution. But there are lots of what-ifs in the energy field. China has devoted a great deal of resources toward the development of fusion energy, something that we don't hear much about. But, a fusion reaction is essentially a magnetically contained hydrogen bomb reaction that is exploited for the production of a vast amount of electricity. I mean, probably with 2 to 4 fusion reactors, China could basically forego the equivalent of all the oil that it has to import. I mean, it still have to import some oil to run all of its mobile systems, cars, trucks, aircraft, whatnot. But if they make a breakthrough in fusion energy, then they will have made an amazingly important step toward becoming probably the dominant superpower on the planet. And that is a very scary prospect for the United States.
And that's a whole other topic for the next show in a segment we do with you. Well, Dr. Richard Fisher with the International Assessment and Strategy Center, thank you so much. We appreciate the work you do, and we certainly appreciate the analysis that you share with us here on the program. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
Great. Take care.